Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Margaret MacMillan and David Bryant.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our angels. Thank you to our readers. You keep this festival going, and we appreciate every one of your ticket purchases and all that you do. I call it an intellectual pop-up village, and I hope you agree because we're really doing graduate level work here. It's really my honor to interview Dr. MacMillan this morning, and we went over her resume and let us say impressive. Professor Margaret MacMillan is a Canadian historian and professor at the University of Oxford. She is former provost of Trinity College and professor of history at the University of Toronto and previously at Ryerson University. She is now an honorary fellow at Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford. And thank you so much for being with us. This book, and it is a heavyweight intellectually, also fine print in this size, I must say, tries to capture, and we'll certainly hear from our professor in a moment, tries to capture a moment that last night when Scott Berg spoke. How many of you were at last night's event? Well, you heard from Scott Berg the importance of the Great War, World War I, and he certainly made mention of the Treaty of Versailles, and that's what we're here to talk about today with perhaps the world's expert on the Treaty of Versailles, which was put together over a 6-month period primarily. I guess it lingered even more than 6 months. I don't know where to begin. Why don't you begin for us, Margaret? Where are we with the Treaty of Versailles in 2018, if that's possible to connect those?
Well, I think there's still a view which, I'd like to start by thanking, echoing your thanks, but also thank you for inviting me to come here in January, which is not the warmest month in Toronto. So it's rather nice to get away and see the sun and feel too hot. There is still a view, I think, that the settlements made in Paris, and there were a series of agreements and treaties, basically with all the defeated nations, 5 defeated nations, and other agreements thrown into the mix. So collectively, I call them the Paris peace settlements. There is still a view that those peace settlements were so bad and was so unjust and caused such damage that they led directly to 1939. And my short answer to that is, what was everyone doing in those 20 years? You can't just say that something that happened in 1919 leads directly to the outbreak of war in 1939. An awful lot happened in between. And so what I think is important is to look at what was happening then and to ask ourselves, which I think we always should in history, what would we have done differently if we had been there trying to make peace? And I think we should remember that the circumstances for making peace were not very good. And it wasn't like 1945 when the defeated nations were utterly defeated and occupied. I mean, Germany and Japan and the other defeated nations had no choice. You know, they had no choice and a peace was imposed on them. And we don't hear complaints about that, funnily enough. We don't hear complaints about the great injustice done to Germany in 1945 or the great injustice done to Japan in 1945. The conditions in 1919 were different. The Allied powers had won, but the nations that had been defeated were still intact. Germany was not occupied. It was still, very little of it was occupied. It was still a major power. Its infrastructure was largely untouched because it hadn't been fought over in the war. And what was also happening as a result of the war was that old institutions were crumbling, empires were disappearing, the German Empire had fallen to pieces, and Poland had reconstituted itself on the map, taking in German, Austrian, and Russian territory. Russia was in revolution and about to go into a civil war, in fact, starting a civil war. Austria-Hungary had disappeared from the map of Europe, and the Ottoman Empire was splintering. Plus, you had revolutionary ideas spreading out from Russia. You had turmoil all over Europe, and you had ethnic nationalisms. And these were not easy to deal with. And so I think we have to, I'm not defending what people did in Paris, but I think we have to put ourselves back into that position and say, what could they do? What was it possible for them to do? And what were the circumstances in which they were doing it? They were creatures of their time, and they had certain things they had to work with.
Well, limits to their capabilities, certainly, with all of the pressures on them.
Yeah.
On the matter of Germany, there was a sense, I'm sure, of many of the participants in the Versailles peace talks, or treaty talks, were a sense of punishing Germany.
Yep.
Is that correct? That the sense was, well, Germany started this,
Yeah.
so maybe we should really give it to Germany once and for all so this doesn't happen again.
I think that was very much the view in Paris, and I think they had good grounds for thinking Germany had started it. Now, since we've debated it, we've argued over it, and there's still no consensus, but at the time, I think those who had won the war felt that Germany was largely responsible for starting the war by encouraging Austria-Hungary to try and destroy Serbia, by backing it with what came to be known as the blank check. Germany had mobilized and moved its troops. Germany had attacked France. And this is something people always forget. They say, why were the French so vindictive? Well, Germany had invaded France. I mean, the Germans had said to France in 1914, we fear you might attack us. To show that you won't, please surrender all your frontier forts, and we'll give them back to you when we finish fighting Russia. And we'll pay you some rent for occupying them while we were there. Well, you can understand that the French couldn't accept that. The French were invaded by Germany. The Belgians were invaded by Germany. And so, yes, there was a feeling that Germany should be punished for this. And rightly or wrongly, those who were in charge of France in 1919 were very apprehensive about Germany. They saw Germany there, as I said, more or less intact. They knew that the German birth rate was higher than the French birth rate, which meant there were more potential German soldiers coming along every generation. And those in charge had been there. Clémenceau, the French Prime Minister, had been there in 1870 when the Germans had invaded France. The German Confederation had invaded France. He'd been there when Paris had been besieged by German guns. And he'd been there again in 1914 when France had been invaded. And so had Marshal Foch, the supreme French commander. And what they were frightened of, and it turned out to be absolutely right, was that a resurgent Germany would do it a third time. And as it happened, a resurgent Germany did do it a third time. So they wanted to limit German power. They wanted to prevent Germany, if they possibly could, from doing this again. I mean, there was talk of dividing Germany up into its various component states, as it had been before 1871. They wanted to punish Germany. Now, this may have been unreasonable, but you can see why they felt it. Again, I think we have to understand what it is they were thinking at the time.
The scope of the Great War, World War I, you capture beautifully in this introductory phrase here, sentence here. There had been fighting in Asia, in Africa, in the Pacific Islands, and in the Middle East, but most had been on European soil along the crazed network of trenches that stretched from Belgium in the north down to the Alps in the south, along Russia's borders with Germany and its ally Austria-Hungary, and in the Balkans themselves. One more sentence. Only Spain, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and the Scandinavian countries had managed to stay out. It truly was a world war.
It was a world war, and it was a war that, as it dragged on, I mean, the two sides, one of the tragedies of Europe was that it had this huge industrial capacity, and its economies, most of them were among the leading economies of the world, which meant they had a huge capacity to sustain armies in the field. And so Europe's very strengths told against it when it came to the war. And the other tragedy was that the two sides were so evenly balanced that neither could win a victory. You got temporary victories, and then the other side would pull itself back together again. And so both sides searched desperately for more allies because they needed the manpower and the resources. And as the war went on, more and more powers were drawn in. I mean, a lot were drawn in right away because those European nations fighting were also empires. And so my own country, Canada, was part of the war automatically. I mean, the British declared war on behalf of their empire. And the French had an empire, and the Germans had a smaller empire, but those empires were also called into the war. So you had people traveling halfway around the world to fight in Europe. 1 million Indian soldiers fighting in the Middle East and Europe, Vietnamese soldiers, African soldiers, Australian soldiers, Canadian soldiers. It was a world war, and it also was fought in different parts around the world, as you pointed out.
It's, I think, remarkable to think of a gathering of so many, perhaps the world's most important people at that time, probably mostly male, we know that. And yet Woodrow Wilson was the star of this, if that's kind of a 2018 speak again. But Woodrow Wilson, as I read, had a chair that was slightly higher than other people's chairs. He was probably taller than anybody else there. And when you add the top hat, you've certainly got some height going. But also, his, as we saw last night from Scott Berg, was this sense that Woodrow Wilson was going to correct the world's ills and straighten things out once and for all.
We should always be careful when we wish for messiahs who are going to come and solve everything for us, because what we project onto them is a whole lot of different things that they can't possibly do. And the Europeans who welcomed Woodrow Wilson, and he was welcomed, I mean, he did articulate the hope that many Europeans shared, that the world would somehow become a better place, that all the sacrifice and all the waste and all the loss would result in something better. And he was greeted when he first came to Europe by huge crowds. But if you actually looked at what those crowds were saying, they were saying, yes, we want a better world, but in the case of the French, we also want Germany to pay. In the case of the Italians, yes, we'd like a better world, but we also want our frontiers adjusted. We want more territory. So that what people wanted was different in every country. What they were projecting onto Wilson was that he's going to get it all for us. You know, we're going to have a better world, we're going to have a better life, we're going to have the territory we want, we're going to have our enemies put down, we're going to do better than our neighbors. So I think what was expected of him was beyond what anyone could deliver. He himself, and I think Scott Berg brought this out very well last night, had this idea, which is curious, I think, in a democratic politician, that he understood the people better than anyone else, and that he could speak directly to them, which is dangerous, I think. And he felt that he could speak to the Italians, he could speak to the French, he could speak even to the Germans, and they would listen to him. And it was an illusion, and he began to realize that it was an illusion.
Well, naive, I guess, might apply as well, in that self-determination was the leitmotif of the entire process, if I'm not mistaken. And how likely is self-determination when you have national governments looking out for their political interests and really the leadership of those countries driving this?
The trouble with self-determination is, and I think even today, we're never entirely sure what it means. It's a tremendously emotive word, and Woodrow Wilson didn't use it that much, actually, but he came to be associated with it. And he himself was always rather vague about it. Did he mean that and even if you're talking about self-determination, what is a people? How do you define a people? They define themselves, but in many cases they are in the process of working it out. And so you had old nations like the Poles, but you had newly emerging nations in Paris, peoples who were just beginning to see themselves as nations like the Kurds, for example. So it's a process, and it never ends, of course, because there's always a new nation popping up somewhere as people begin to define themselves in this way. And Wilson was never clear whether he felt that a group who defined themselves as a nation had the right for full independence with their own land, or whether they simply had the right to govern themselves. I mean, when he talked in the 14 points and elsewhere about the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a big multinational empire, he talked about autonomy within the empire, so that these people should have the right to rule themselves, perhaps use their own language, go to courts in their own language. He never specified exactly what he meant. But once he talked about it, it gave encouragement to nations around the world. And what most of them wanted, and it's true today, most nations say we want to be fully independent. I mean, you look at what's happening in Catalonia. They don't say we want to control our language and our schools and our culture, which is in fact usually what is most important to nations. What they want is full independence. And Wilson didn't create this longing. It was happening. It was happening all over Europe and beginning to happen in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world. But he articulated support for it. And when a powerful country like the United States says, yes, self-determination is a good idea, people will seize on that, as they did, and say, good, he means we should be independent and have our own country. He later said, apparently, if I'd realized quite how many nations there were, I might not have said it. And there's a very telling moment when Irish nationalists want to come and see him in Paris and hope to enlist his support against the British in their demands for independence for Ireland. And he refuses to see them. He said, they've got democracy. They can go through Parliament. They can talk to the British government that way. I'm not going to see them. And so he was never entirely clear what he meant by it. But it was something that was happening anyway. He didn't create this mood. And what happened as a result of the war with the disappearance of the empires is suddenly peoples who had been talking about one day we may have our own country suddenly saw the opportunity. And so you've got this tremendous fluidity and sense of opportunity, doors opening in 1919, in a feeling rather like 1989 at the end of the Cold War. Unless we do it now, in 2 or 3 years things will settle down, we won't be able to do it.
And where does class fit into this, in the sense that Bolshevism was rising? A classless society, labor class, owning means of production, et cetera, Marxism. Where does class fit into Paris?
It's very interesting because there had been a class war through Europe before, and indeed through much of the rest of the world before 1914, the 1914-18 war. I mean, the strength of industrialization was also one that tended to polarize classes, and there had been the growth of big socialist and powerful socialist movements in Europe and elsewhere around the world before 1914, and demands for a greater share in the profits, a greater say in government, pushing for more votes to be given to ordinary people. So this was happening before the First World War, and there were all sorts of revolutionary and socialist ideas, some revolutionary, some not, in Europe and the world before 1914. What the Bolsheviks do, of course, is suddenly take over a whole country and inspire similar revolutions. I mean, Hungary had a communist government for 6 months between 1919 and 1920. There was a communist government in Bavaria, which was more comic opera for about a week. But this was not seen as comic opera at the time.
Maybe that's your next book.
The comic opera. You could write. Maybe Strauss should have written an opera about it. But so there was a class war, and there was a fear in Paris of revolution, as much as there was a fear of these ethnic nationalisms. Sometimes they overlapped, and so you would get, for example, there was a Polish nationalism, and then you got a Lithuanian nationalism, and the Lithuanians were often people who spoke a language very similar to the Poles. But Lithuanian nationalism was much more supported by the working class and the peasants, whereas Polish, so they reacted against Polish nationalism. So you get these different, currents often intersecting. But it was a very troubled time. I mean, the whole peace conference had to be closed down in Paris on the 1st of May, 1919, because there were huge demonstrations in the streets by the left on May Day, and the government cracked down, and they were running battles, and people were killed. And they couldn't actually have most of the regular meetings of the peace conference because it was too dangerous.
How did the conference work? I know it's not fascinating, maybe for some, but in a bureaucratic sense, how did the conference come together? Subgroups and committees and subcommittees?
There's somewhere in the British Foreign Office the most extraordinary diagram of how the conference was meant to work. And it looks like a sort of astrological map. It has a sort of big round thing in the middle and then spokes going out. And then the spokes are joined by other spokes. And the whole thing is meant to revolve around, and things are meant to feed into the middle, and things are meant to feed out of the middle. It's all beautifully done in color. It's about this big. It didn't work like that at all. So
that was that was what they were working off of.
No, I think they gave it up. They came to Paris thinking it will be like the Congress of Vienna in 1814, 1815. But the world was different. I mean, the first British diplomats who came were all issued with 1,000 calling cards. And they were told to go and leave their calling cards on all the diplomats from other countries. And then the diplomats from the other countries would come and leave their calling cards, and then eventually they'd meet. And that didn't happen. I mean, it was a different world. And it was an improvisation. They started out with a plenary session where all the countries that were on the winning side were going to meet and hammer out agreed peace terms, which they would then go to offer to the defeated. The defeated would then come to Paris, and they'd have more plenary sessions where they'd all sit around tables and talk. It took them so long to agree on any peace terms that they felt they didn't dare invite the defeated nations to then have another full-scale discussion. I mean, the peace conference started out as a preliminary peace conference, and then gradually it just became the peace conference. They also realized you couldn't make negotiations with 31 or 32 different countries. And so what you got was initially the 5 big powers meeting. So Japan, Italy, France, Germany, France, Britain, and the United States. And even that was a bit cumbersome. And so they settled finally on something called the Council of Four, which was Woodrow Wilson, Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain, Clémenceau, the Prime Minister of France, and Orlando, the Prime Minister of Italy, who wasn't always there because sometimes he walked out weeping into his handkerchief. He was rather emotional.
That's how we'll end today.
Anyway. But they also set up all sorts of ad hoc committees. And so it was really improvised, and sometimes the Council of Four would get into very small details, and sometimes they'd leave very big things to the committees. And so there were people working all over Paris, but it wasn't very coherent. What was also happening, because you had this extraordinary concentration of power, I mean, we will never have another conference like it. It's impossible to think of the American president going to Paris for 6 months. He did come back to the United States for a month in the middle, but even to think of an American president being out of the country for anything more than, 3 or 4 days, or 10 days at the most, they sat there, and because they were there, others came. And so you had petitioners, you had women coming to ask for votes and rights for women, you had African Americans coming to ask for rights for African Americans, you had people from the French colonies coming to ask for independence for their colonies, you had humanitarian groups, because this is where you came. You might as well come there because everyone was there. And so you had this extraordinary mix of people, plus it was a conference that was done in very much in the public gaze, and so there were hundreds, literally hundreds of journalists there who were reporting on it. So if you were there and part of it, was an exhilarating time. You know, even those who said we worry about the great responsibility said it was actually great fun.
You have a connection to Lloyd George, do you not?
Well, I have a very distant connection. I'm a great-granddaughter.
Well, that's pretty significant.
Well, I like to think it meant nothing for me as an historian. I never met him. I was born a year before he died. And I grew up hearing some stories about him, but not... luckily, I grew up in Canada, where most people didn't know who he was. I remember one of my students saying to me in the 1980s, "I didn't realize you were related to Boy George."
Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah. So, but it was quite good to have that sort of freedom. But so I'd like to think I approached him very much as an historian, not as a descendant.
The picture you're painting is just so perfect of coming from all over the place, and we discussed this a little bit in the green room. And please elaborate on it. The petitioners came from countries that existed and ones that were just dreams. Some, such as the Zionists, spoke for millions. Others, such as the representatives of the Åland Islands in the Baltic, for a few thousand. A few arrived, this is where it really gets good. A few arrived too late. The Koreans from Siberia set out on foot in February 1919, and by the time the main part of the peace conference ended, now remember it started in January, so they set out on foot in February 1919, and by the time the main part of the peace conference ended in June, they had only reached the Arctic port of Archangel.
Yeah. Well, they had to travel by foot and by dog sled, and it took them
Remarkable.
a lot. Yeah.
Well, again, proving this was, the whole world was not only watching, but wanted to participate.
Well, yes, well, it made such sense. And in fact, they did a lot of side deals. I mean, really, it was the beginning of regulation of civil aviation, because they were all there. And they said, well, actually, why not talk about it now? This is a new type of transportation, which is clearly going to develop. And they did deals on waterways and canals. I mean, I didn't put that in my book because it's not the most riveting unless you're an expert on waterways and canals. But
Well, a remarkable moment, that's for sure. How long did it take you to put this incredible volume together?
quite a long time. I became interested in it when I was teaching. And I was teaching modern history of various sorts. And I kept on coming across, it kept striking me that this was discussed at the Paris Peace Conference, or this country came into existence at the Peace Conference, or this issue was discussed at the Peace Conference, whether it was the League of Nations, anti-slavery, the creation of Yugoslavia, the creation of Czechoslovakia. So much seems to me to have happened there. And I was so interested in the people who were there, because there were very famous people at the time, and there were people who were going to become famous. And there was a young American lawyer called John Foster Dulles. There was a man called Prince Konoye, who later became Prime Minister of Japan just at the beginning of the Second World War. There was, you probably know, the waiter at the Ritz Hotel, later called Ho Chi Minh, who tried to present a petition about Indochina to the assembled powers. So I was fascinated by just who was there. I think there's a side, at least in my type of history, where we are great gossips. And so who was there, who was talking to whom, what was happening? And so I decided to write a book on it. There were a number of books, and I thought none of them were very comprehensive. They looked at a single country or a single issue, and I thought it was a world, as you mentioned. It did deal with the world. It was very important for the Chinese, very important for the Japanese. I thought it was very important for the Middle East, and so I thought I would write a book, and I just kept plugging away, and I couldn't find a publisher. I wrote about 5 chapters and a full thing, and I began sending it to publishers, and I got answers. My favorite answer was sorry, but nobody wants to read about a bunch of dead white men sitting around a table talking about peace treaties. And I said, well, I think there's actually more to it than that, because it did deal with the world and war and peace and all these issues. And I finally found a publisher, but I worked on it for about 20 years.
Really?
Yeah.
The Ho Chi Minh moment, I remember, was discussed during the anti-war movement.
Yeah.
A lot in the 60s in America. And the sense was, if only Woodrow Wilson had gotten off his high horse and had listened to Ho Chi Minh, maybe that war and 58,000 dead wouldn't have resulted. So going back to just the significance of this Paris moment, so much can be connected to it.
I think so much can be connected. I can see why Woodrow Wilson, we don't know if Woodrow Wilson ever saw the petition. Ho Chi Minh presented it. it probably got filed somewhere because there were hundreds of these things, from people all over the world. And the pressures on these statesmen, I mean, I looked, and I think I did just a brief thing. I thought I'll just look at one day of one statesman, and Woodrow Wilson's records were kept very well. And so I looked at his engagements for one day, and it was 10 different issues, 10 different delegations, and juggling all these things, and trying to make a peace, and going to meetings. And so I think, they couldn't listen to everything, but a lot of resentment came out of the peace conference. I mean, the Chinese were deeply resentful. I mean, the Chinese were an ally in the First World War, and they had actually made a difference. They'd sent something like 100,000 laborers to France. And if you go to the battlefields in France, you'll still see Chinese characters on some of the gravestones, because they didn't fight, but they dug the trenches, they brought the supplies up, they freed other people to fight. They were very, very important. And the Chinese felt that they should get back what Germany had taken in China, and all the foreign powers were taking what they called concessions. Otherwise they'd point a gun at the head of the Chinese government and said, we'd like a contract to run the railways in this bit of China for the next 100 years, and we'd like the right to use and do the mines and develop industries in this particular area for the next 100 years. It was a precursor to, I think, outright annexation. And the Chinese thought, well, we've been an ally, we should get back what Germany had got out of us in the Shandong Peninsula. And instead, the Allies turned around and gave it to Japan, because the Japanese were also an ally in the First World War, and they thought Japan was more powerful and more important. Yeah. Sorry? Sorry, am I talking too quickly?
No, you're talking wonderfully. I never heard the word Germany. Admitted, I'm of German origin. I'm a great admirer of Otto von Bismarck, and I believe that if Otto von Bismarck had been fired by the Kaiser, there may not have been
Well.
another war. But the point I'm getting at, Germany was a victim of that conference. Nothing, they weren't even invited to the League of Nations.
If I can, let's get to the question period. Perhaps I'll deal with that then. I disagree with you, actually. I don't think Germany was a victim of the peace conference. We can talk about that in a moment. If I may just finish on China. The German concessions in China were handed to the Japanese in what was, I think, just clear power politics. They thought Japan was more important. China was in disarray. It really led to huge nationalist outpourings in China. And it led to the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party. Now they couldn't foresee this, but often what seemed like really easy decisions have huge consequences. A lot of the Chinese who had looked to the West, because they thought the West had the best system of government and the fairest system of government, now said, we think they're all great liars. We don't trust them. And by coincidence, there was an alternative right across the border in Russia. There was a new type of government. The Soviets were saying, as they were to become, were saying, we want to help you. To the Chinese, we'll give back all the territory we took from you in the 19th century. No one else was saying this to the Chinese. I mean, the territory never came back. It hasn't come back to this day. But the point is, that's the point. That's what they were saying at the time.
Back to Woodrow Wilson for just a moment. The sense was that he was the biggest loser of the conference. Is that fair? And, well, to follow up, after the steamship ride home, I guess, he had a massive stroke.
Yeah.
The conference took a tremendous toll on Wilson.
Yeah. He wasn't a well man, I think, when he went to Paris. And there was a pattern, which Scott Berg talks about very well in his book. There was a pattern in his life of he would suddenly collapse. And there was an episode when he was about 50, and it may have been an early stroke. When they didn't define it like that in those days, but he suddenly collapsed and lost sight in one eye. And he had a collapse in Paris. No one knows whether it was a flu or whether it was, again, a sort of stroke, a forerunner of the massive one he had. But the conference took a terrible strain on him. Those who were with him said he got grayer and grayer, and there was a twitch in his face which got more and more pronounced. He wasn't entirely the loser. I mean, I think we underestimate or overestimate, I think, how much power the United States actually had at the peace conference. We tend to read back into 1919 what we know happened later. The United States became a superpower, and it was a superpower clearly by 1945. It wasn't yet that powerful. It was powerful, but it was potentially going to be more powerful. But of course, people didn't know at the time, and the British was still the dominant empire in the world. The French still had a huge colonial empire, and so Wilson could certainly put pressure on them, but he couldn't have it all his own way. And he did get what he thought was the most important thing, and that was the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was the first item of business. He insisted on that. He chaired that committee himself, and it was written. The Covenant of the League of Nations is the first part of the Treaty of Versailles with Germany and the treaties with the other defeated nations. And so he created the League of Nations. The United States, in the end, didn't join, but I think, and Scott Berg referred to this last night, part of the trouble was that Wilson would take no compromise on it, and he wouldn't compromise with those in the Senate who wanted reservations about it, who wanted to possibly modify it. The European leaders later on said, Lloyd George later said, for example, we would have accepted modification because we thought it's so important to have the United States join. We would have been prepared to do that. But the treaty was defeated in the Senate, and so therefore the League of Nations was defeated in the Senate by Republicans and Democrats who Wilson told to vote against it. So a different political leader might have got it through, and history might have been different. We'll never know.
Would you be willing to do some Q&A at this point?
Yes, absolutely. Delighted.
Well, we'll start with the question from Mr. Beschloss. And Maury, if I can sort of paraphrase, you were saying that the Germans were, the conference was very unfair to Germany, and the result, and that's perhaps what we were discussing earlier, the revisionist view of this. Please elaborate again. We touched on it before, but if you would.
The Germans certainly felt it was very unfair, and I think there were a number of reasons for that. I think the way in which the armistice was negotiated was through a series of open notes. They sent a note to Woodrow Wilson, and they sent it openly because it was the only way they could get it to him because of communications, and he sent an open note back. What the German government and what the German people felt is that Woodrow Wilson was saying to them, we're going to treat you very fairly, there'll be no punishment. He didn't actually say no punishment, and he believed Germany should be punished because he did believe it had started the war. But he also indicated that Germany should become a republic, a constitutional republic like the United States, which Germany did. There was a revolution just at the end of the First World War. And so a lot of Germans felt, we've done what the Americans asked, we are a different Germany, why should we pay for the sins of the old Germany? So that was one thing. We were sort of indicated, it was indicated to us by President Wilson that if we became a different Germany, all would be okay. Secondly, a lot of Germans did not realize that they had lost the war, and that was a myth that was fostered very much by the High Command and others. Germany had lost the war. Germany lost in the summer of 1918. There were a series of German defeats, and if you look at the way the lines moved, they moved back to the German border. The German armies were shattered. Ludendorff and Hindenburg went to the government, whom they had kept completely in the dark, telling them everything was fine, and said, you've got to get an armistice immediately. It's hopeless. And certainly, I think for a lot of the German commanders, it was hopeless. Germany lost, and if you look at the terms of the armistice, on November the 11th, 1918, it's a surrender. Germany surrendered all its heavy military equipment, its big guns, its tanks, everything. It surrendered its submarine fleet, and it surrendered its high seas fleet. So that is a surrender. Germany lost. But the Germans increasingly came to feel they hadn't lost. So if you think, A, that you've done everything the Americans want you to do, you become a different Germany, therefore you have no connection with the old Germany, which did these bad things. Secondly, you didn't really lose, so why should you pay anything? Thirdly, I think nobody who loses, whether it's a court case or war, ever thinks the arrangement is fair. Have you ever had anyone come out of a court who's lost saying, no, that was actually fair. The judge was absolutely right. You know, it doesn't happen. And the Germans felt it was unfair. Now, if you want to do a comparison, look at the treaty the Germans imposed on the Russians in March 1918. The Russians pulled out of the war. The treaty was called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. It is savage. The Russians lost most of the Ukraine, most of Belarus. They had to hand over whatever gold they had left. They had to accept that large parts of what had been Russia would now be administered by Germany or Austria-Hungary. So when people win, they're not always very good about it. The Treaty of Versailles has got a very bad name, and I think a lot of it is to do, well, with Germany taking responsibility for the start of the war, what's known as the War Guilt Clause. It doesn't use the word guilt, it says responsibility. It's written by John Foster Dulles, actually, to establish Germany's liability to pay reparations. And Wilson accepted that Germany should pay for the damage that it had done, particularly to Belgium and France, because most of the war in the West had been fought on the soil of Belgium and France. And Germany had sucked everything it could out of Belgium. It had taken animals, it had taken gold, it had taken Belgians as forced labor. So the Belgian economy had really been shattered. And a lot of Belgians would say they've never really recovered from the occupation between 1914 and 1918. So the treaty was controversial because Germans felt they shouldn't bear guilt for the war, and that became more and more the case as time went on because historians began looking at it and others began looking and saying, well, maybe nobody caused it, maybe it was just an accident. Well, if it was an accident, if everyone's responsible, no one's responsible, then why should Germany be responsible? That was one thing that happened as time went by. The second thing that happened was the reparations, I think particularly. The reparations bill, what damages Germany should pay for the war, for having started the war as the Allies saw it, was huge. And the Allied statesmen knew Germany would never be able to pay it. But they couldn't tell their own publics that. And so what they did is they fudged it. And fudges can work, but they can be dangerous. And the bill was divided into three. There was the first part, which Germany paid, quite a small part. The second part was a bit bigger. I'm simplifying this, but the second part was a bit bigger, and it was to be paid by the German government issuing bonds, which it would back. And it did pay some of that. The third part was by far the biggest, and Germany would pay that when it had paid the first two parts. Well, you can guess what happened. It never paid the first two parts. The Allies knew it was never going to pay the first two parts completely. Germany was never going to pay the third part, but that wasn't how it appeared to the German public. And so everything that went wrong in Germany, and a lot did go wrong, but a lot of it was to do with bad government policy, was blamed on reparations. I even came across a memoir the other day by two sisters who said, before the war we could send our laundry out once a week, now we can only send it out once every 2 weeks. It's all the fault of reparations. So,
That's
anyway,
a
that's my
summary.
view on it. But
Yes, sir.
Do you think the reparations caused the massive inflation in Germany between World War I and World War II?
oh, sorry.
Yeah,
sure.
no, please.
There was a massive inflation in Germany in 1923 in particular. Do I think reparations caused it? No. I think what happened very briefly is the Belgians and the French were getting fed up because the Germans were not paying as they should have been paying. And so they decided to enforce it by invading the Ruhr, which was the richest part of Germany. And basically what the Germans did is more or less go on strike. And they refused to pay. And the German government allowed inflation to take place because the more inflation rose, the less the German bill was. I think it was totally irresponsible. There were other problems with German fiscal policy. The Germans had paid for the war by issuing bonds to the German people, and they had assumed they were going to, if they won, they would simply pay off those bonds by whatever they'd taken from the defeated countries, as they had done already with the case of the Russians. They'd taken whatever gold they could get. And so they suddenly had these huge numbers of bonds, which were taken out largely by the middle classes, because they were the ones with money, which they had to keep paying interest on. Because they were afraid of revolution, they had also established, as they already had, but they continued their very expensive social security programs, because they didn't dare cut those, and they didn't dare stop paying on the bonds. And so they were in a bind. And so the inflation, I think, was caused by internal weaknesses in the German government and system. But that didn't matter. I mean, perception is really important in politics, as we know. And the perception of the Germans was that what happened to them was the result of reparations. And it was a very convenient scapegoat. And of course, that inflation was dreadful because it destroyed people, it destroyed families, it destroyed social bonds. People who had worked hard all their lives, put their money in their savings as they'd been told to do, suddenly were wiped out. And I think it took Germany a long time to recover. And I think you still see in the attitude of the German government, they are very worried about inflation still.
Other questions?
Germany did not start the first war. It had to do with Austria-Hungary wanting to march into Serbia, and then Serbia calling for Mother Russia to come in. And Russia asked France to support its attack on Germany. That's when Germany came into
The question is about the actual start of the war. Did Germany start the
Yeah.
war?
Well, I don't want to get into a debate with you about how the war started, but very briefly, and it depends when you go back. You can go back 20 years and say the war really started when Britain and France drew closer together, or it started when Germany started the naval race. But if you're looking at what happened in the summer of 1914, which I have done, what happened is the Serbs connived at the assassination of the heir to the Austrian throne. Austria-Hungary wanted an excuse to destroy Serbia, which they saw as a threat to the very existence of Austria-Hungary. they had the perfect excuse because the Serbian nationalists had just killed their heir to their throne. They went to the German government and said, what would you do if we attacked Serbia? And they both knew, both Austria and Germany knew there was a risk that Russia might come in to defend Serbia because it had defended it, it had supported it before. And the German government gave a blank check. They said, whatever you do, we'll back you. Now, is that Germany being responsible for the war or not? It certainly didn't do anything to stop Austria-Hungary. I'm sorry, I'm not going to debate it with you. We can talk about it later, but because I don't think everybody can hear what you're saying. I've got the microphone, so it's unfair to you. So I don't want to drown you out.
There'll be a conversation later.
But I think it depends how you see responsibility. I think Austria-Hungary was utterly reckless. I think they knew there was a danger Russia would come in. Russia had been humiliated previously by Austria-Hungary. It was clear that Russia hadn't enjoyed that. I think Germany was reckless. I think they gave a blank check to Austria-Hungary and said, do what you like. And they knew there was a danger that Russia would come in. France was not going to attack Germany. It was a defensive alliance. The French were there. The French and the Russians had a defensive alliance. They would come to each other's support if one was attacked by the other, not by a third party. And so I think the French, although people have tried to blame them, were innocent bystanders in all this. It was the French who were attacked by Germany. The trouble was Germany had this brilliant war plan, which meant fighting on two fronts, and it didn't have a war plan to fight just on one front, which is why you always need to keep an eye on what the military are planning, because you may find their plans get you into a real mess.
And governments make wars. This is the only library in the United States where this debate is going on, by the way. Yes, ma'am, in the... Middle East and the Treaty of Versailles.
Well, the Middle East, the Treaty of Versailles was mainly with Germany, so it doesn't do much for the Middle East. The main treaty for the Middle East was Sèvres, which was signed in a suburb of Paris. And it was signed with the Ottoman Empire, which was about to disappear anyway. The Ottoman rulers were about to disappear. And what it did basically was strip what had already happened, the non-Turkish territories away from the Turkish heartland. As we know now, the British and French had already done a deal to carve up the Middle East in Sykes-Picot. It was a loose deal, and it didn't have the force of a treaty, but it was sort of, I won't say gentleman's agreement, because they weren't gentlemen. They were 19th century imperialists, and they thought the Middle East was there for the taking. They thought those people weren't ready to rule themselves, and so they did a deal where, in the end, they adjusted it, but in the end, the British got Jordan and Palestine, the French and got Iraq, and the French got Syria and Lebanon, and they would manage them. In the end, they had to do it as mandates under the League of Nations because Woodrow Wilson insisted on it. So it was slightly better than an outright colony, but not much. And at the same time, of course, what they had also done in the heat of the war is they'd made a couple of other promises. And in wartime, and I'm not defending it, but in wartime, under pressure, in moments of crisis, you will make promises which you hope you're never going to have to pay off. And they had promised the Arabs that if they revolted against the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, and began to attack their railways, and which was important in the war effort in the Middle East, took pressure off Suez and so on. If they waged war on the Ottoman Empire, that there would be an Arab kingdom. And there was a lot of disagreement about what that Arab kingdom might look like. A lot of it was the same territory that Britain and France were quietly distributing to themselves under Sykes-Picot. And then, of course, the third promise was the Balfour Declaration, which we've just celebrated the anniversary of in November 2017. The Balfour Declaration was in the form of a letter written by the British Secretary of State, the Foreign Secretary, to Lord Rothschild, who was seen as the leader of the British Jews and who was himself a Zionist. And it said, briefly, His Majesty's government look with favor on the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. It being understood that nothing, I can't remember exactly, it being understood that nothing must be done to affect the rights of the other minorities there. Well, the other minority was 90% Arab. So the Arabs immediately felt that this was contravening what they felt they'd been promised. Of course, for Zionists, supporters of a Jewish homeland, this was something that they had longed for and wanted. But I think a lot of the troubles in the Middle East are to do with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the subsequent deals that were made by outside powers to dispose of those territories, without really consulting the people who lived there. You know, this was a 19th century imperialist view that these people weren't ready, probably never would be ready, and they should do what they were told. You know, it was very, very arrogant. And it doesn't explain everything that's happened in the Middle East, but it's a very important part of the history we need to know about.
We have 48 seconds. Not enough time for a question, but certainly enough time to say thank you for all of you for attending.
Yeah.
And thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Professor MacMillan,
Thank you.
the intelligence in this room is remarkable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.